A mighty battle raged on, with fiery projectiles hurled at a castle. Numerous troops struggled to defend the castle against the approaching hordes. Despite their efforts, parts of the castle crumbled, and people on the walls plunged into the depths. People were torn apart during the battle as well. Orcs climbed up the castle walls and infiltrated the interior. While the people tried to defend themselves, they were steadily pushed back. Nevertheless, their unwavering courage remained unshaken, and they fought tirelessly, determined to defeat every single orc. However, the orcs themselves were unwavering in their fighting spirit and continued to attack without regard for losses. The orc mages blocked the raining fireballs with their magic. A magical dome thwarted all the attacks from the people, perfectly shielding the orcs. But the orcs had another trump card up their sleeves and put themselves into a berserker state. Deputy Commander Filion of the humans recognized their condition and was displeased that the orcs were now in a berserker state. Together with some of his comrades, he stood on a tower on the south side and realized that it was only a matter of time until the south gate fell. He looked down at the orcs and recognized that their overwhelming numbers alone posed a problem. But the real problem would arise if the Orc Lord decided to join the fight as well. The Orc Lord was different from the other orcs because he was also a master of aura. That meant he could use special aura abilities. Meanwhile, the orcs had already taken the walls. It was a terrible massacre. They ran as they pleased and killed all the people who fell into their hands. Although the people did their best to stop them and defend themselves, the orcs simply used them as stepping stones for their massive feat. However, a mysterious turquoise aura rose from the bodies of the people, whether the orcs held them in their hands or they lay on the blood-stained battlefield. Everywhere was the delicate turquoise mist rising from the corpses, gathering into a larger source of energy in the center. More and more people emitted this mist. Yet it seemed that even the people themselves did not know where the mist came from. The warrior corpses, enveloped in the mist, suddenly rose as undead zombies and mindlessly attacked the orcs. And so the battle raged on between the humans and the orcs. The humans realized that there must be a necromancer on their side because the summoned zombies, undead, and skeletons fought alongside them, filling the battlefield to the point where there was hardly a free spot left. In front of the southern city gate, the Orc Lord continued to fight undeterred, overwhelming the humans with the help of his aura. However, a challenger was already floating in front of him. Black and purple magical spheres floated around him, mysteriously flashing. It was the Necromancer with green hair and a braid. Despite his magic, he had muscles and carried a sword. The Necromancer realized that ordinary zombies couldn't win against an aura master. He raised his hand forward and opened portals behind him, from which powerful monsters streamed onto the battlefield. Together with his numerous undead, who had reached a considerable number by now, he marched onto the battlefield. But the Orc Lord only needed to swing his weapon once forcefully to effortlessly defeat and sweep away the smaller undead from the battlefield. His body was completely surrounded by aura and emitted a faint red glow. With his powerful arms, the Orc Lord prepared to strike and brought it down with full force onto the ground. After his attack, the red aura faded, and the Orc Lord noticed something. Behind him stood a powerful skeleton, stronger than its smaller siblings, also preparing for a vertical strike. However, the Orc Lord brushed aside the attack and countered. Subsequently, another strong undead rushed towards him, delivering a mighty blow that prevented the Orc Lord from countering. Seizing the opportunity, the skeleton prepared for another strike. Together with the larger panther undead, they launched a barrage of attacks against the Orc Lord, who skillfully evaded them. But suddenly, the panther saw its chance and dealt a tremendous blow to the Orc Lord, sending him flying backward. However, the Orc Lord withstood the attack and managed to stay on his feet. While his subordinates continued to fight on the battlefield, the Necromancer also fought with his sword before the gates. The humans observed the Necromancer and became aware of how formidable the world was. They could hardly believe that there was a Necromancer who also possessed excellent sword skills. He and his subordinates impressed with their performance on the battlefield. His giant crushed his opponents with brute force. His elf, on the other hand, pierced through the enemies and unleashed dark lightning. Another one of his followers shattered the enemies and subsequently paralyzed them before finishing them off with his axe, absorbing their energy in the process. The remaining surviving humans were astonished as they witnessed the spectacle on the battlefield. They realized that a single man with his abilities turned the battlefield upside down and showed them a path to victory, even if he employed forbidden magic from the Empire. Compared to the Necromancer's creatures, the humans seemed tiny. The Orc Lord said he had never thought that ordinary corpses could corner him like this and grinned. He continued to say that the Necromancer shouldn't think for a moment that he had already won just because he landed a good blow. He looked at the Necromancer and found it great that he had found a strong opponent like him on the battlefield. His eyes turned slightly redder, and he entered his berserker state, while his aura radiated from his body. However, the only thoughts the Necromancer had at that moment were that the Orc Lord had a magnificent body that he could make his own. The Necromancer then divided his sword into smaller pieces and personally charged towards the Orc Lord. The Orc Lord also rushed forward, and both prepared to attack. The Necromancer swung his whip-like sword, but it was held back by the Orc's aura spirit, while the real Orc also struck, landing a direct hit on the Necromancer. As a result, the Necromancer's body dissolved into that turquoise light emanating from the soldiers' corpses. Suddenly, the Orc reflexively turned around, attempting to block the real Necromancer's attack directly. A fierce collision occurred, and the Orc's sword got stuck in a pile of bones, as the Necromancer had created a bone shield just before the Orc's counterattack succeeded. In the face of the Orc, he realized that he had to become much stronger. Bones started enveloping him from below, fortifying his body. He recognized that he needed to grow stronger to ensure his own survival, and his body became increasingly covered by bones. He remembered some faces and focused his gaze on the imminent battle. More and more faces appeared before his inner eyes. He wanted to survive and become stronger for himself and for those who were important to him in this world. To be able to protect them all. The bones solidified, forming a breastplate. While he considered his soldiers important, his armor was complete. With his new armor, he stood face to face with the Orc Lord, and both were highly focused. The Orc Lord shouted at the Necromancer, telling him to entertain him well in their final battle. The Necromancer charged forward. Although he wanted to protect all his friends and comrades, he also wanted to continue living as Andreas Cromwell. He rushed toward the Orc Lord with tremendous speed, astonishing everyone involved, causing their jaws to drop. He pushed the Orc Lord back excellently and became even faster. His sword ignited during the attacks, further increasing his striking power. However, the Orc Lord also knew how to defend himself and prepared to counter with his real body and aura. It was a beautiful and grand academy with blue and golden accents. It was called the Rodlan Academy, the most prestigious and supportive academy of the Empire, where those deemed promising come to learn. However, among the students, there were those who were not acknowledged. There were secret rooms that could only be accessed through special portals. In one of these rooms, Andreas conversed with an elderly man who asked him if there was something in this secret room. In this room, there was a barrel of water, and many corpses hung from the ceiling. Andreas apologized as he did not remember where he had placed the body he had been working on last week. The older man walked through the room, passing numerous tables where other undead lay, undergoing experimentation, and was disappointed with Andreas for not remembering where the body was. In these rooms, Andreas and the older man studied the forbidden black magic of the Necromancers. If caught, they would be executed immediately. That was why they had to do this secretly. Andreas picked up a large bottle full of blood and carefully poured it on the floor, using it to trace a magical circle around a corpse on the ground. The older man told him to take a step back as he would now begin the ritual. He held a small skull in one hand and placed his other hand above the blood-smeared magic circle. Subsequently, they both enveloped themselves in a turquoise mist. Andreas also surrounded himself with the turquoise mist, which had now spread throughout half of the room. The corpse within the circle rose but let out a scream, indicating that it was another failure. The older man then said that it was enough for today, and while making notes of the experiment, suggested they clear their heads. On the other hand, Andreas thought that he hadn't learned anything new and was disappointed with today's lesson. A torch illuminated the wall, brightening the room. A mop scrubbed the floor, removing the blood that had been used for the magic circle. Andreas cleaned the floor and was still disappointed. He thought that what he was doing here was very dangerous and that despite the high risk, he hadn't learned anything. He looked at a few books on a shelf and contemplated that even though he was so disappointed, he couldn't simply quit. He took one of the books and said that this was the only place where he could read books about dark magic in peace. He apologized once again to the older man for taking so long to clean up. The older man asked Andreas how he would ever manage everything on his own if he already needed half a day to clean up. Andreas found his teacher's statement foolish and thought to himself that he was only slow because he hadn't been taught anything and had to learn everything on his own. But the older man kept nagging and continued to harass Andreas. He told him that even with a simple job, he would get terribly nervous. With a stern gaze, he looked at Andreas and declared that he wouldn't tolerate any more mistakes from him. Andreas replied that he would do his best to satisfy his master. The teacher continued the conversation and mentioned that he didn't know if he could rely on him, but he would give him another chance. He ordered him to go to the Binhalez National Graveyard and get him another body. He also reminded Andreas that he was the one who had taken him in as an orphan. For this reason, the teacher believed that he always had to prove to him, anywhere and anytime, that he was worth living. If he failed to do so, he knew exactly what would happen. Emotionlessly, Andreas looked at his teacher and knew that he would then become one of his experiments. The teacher then ordered him to go and not waste any more time. Immediately, Andreas set off. As he opened a door to the corridor, he encountered other students, and he realized that his teacher hadn't even given him the money for the trip to the graveyard. He looked at the other students, and they also saw Andreas, surprised that he was still at this school. He quickly pushed through the students and told them that he wasn't just some object to be stared at. Andreas wasn't thrilled with the current situation. But he also didn't know how to escape from it. He was in the third year of the magic department at the academy, but unlike his classmates, he was a talentless heap of garbage. As an orphan from a fallen family, he tried to gain the favor of the strong and defeat the weak. He was the worst kind in the academy, a villain as a third-year student that no one wanted to associate with. But even though he didn't really want to, he had to continue living as Andreas Cromwell. In reality, he was Makoto Kaneshiro, and he found himself in the world of great sin. Originally, he was a member of the special forces who couldn't accept life as a regular citizen. The only thing that provided him solace in the normal world was great sin. A video game. He immersed himself so deeply in the game that he forgot everything around him. After finally completing the game after 12 weeks, he received a call from a mysterious voice that knew his real name and possessed detailed information about him and his gaming habits. He quickly shut down his computer. But without realizing it, he became a character in his own game, 6 months before the actual main story begins. He became Andreas, a character who is always pursued by the shadow of death. Andreas further explained that all the characters in the game had to participate in the same event. They would discover the identity of his teacher, Sharon, and kill him together with Andreas. This made Andreas realize that he needed to find a way to distance himself from Sharon before the main story began. The thought of not being able to escape the characters haunted Andreas. As he looked at the academy, he wondered if he could really make it. Sitting on a bench, Andreas realized that he had no choice but to become stronger before the scenario began. The only thing he could rely on were the special character traits he had acquired while playing. Determined, he stood up and set off on his journey. In doing so, he thought about one of the traits that had been random, and he had received the dual core trait. This allowed him to learn and perfect both magic and sword fighting. He realized that he already had problems and doubted that he could survive if he focused only on one of the two abilities. Learning both in such a short time seemed nearly impossible. He continued on his way, contemplating that he had to rely on the other character trait he had chosen for now. He looked at his hand, adorned with a ring, and realized he had no other choice. He had to choose a trait that best harmonized with his necromancy. Determinedly, he clenched his fist and prepared to select a character trait. In front of him appeared a red system window. For the first time, Andreas looked at the selection of character traits and was astonished by the many possibilities open to him. At first glance, he saw some traits that didn't harmonize with his necromancy at all. Thoughtfully stroking his chin, he considered which trait he should choose. He wanted to focus on one he had never seen before. He was certain that among all the traits, there had to be a good one for him. Amidst the search among all the possible options, he caught sight of the evolution trait. Surprised, he pondered the potential possibilities. Evolution described a phenomenon in which living organisms could reach a higher level. Andreas had never seen this trait before, and it seemed to offer exactly what he needed most urgently now. He desperately wanted to find something that would allow him to grow quickly and leave the others behind. He didn't want to think any longer about what if and ultimately chose this trait. Andreas had made his decision and looked down at the city at the foot of the academy. The system window confirmed his selection before disappearing. Now he saw the possibilities that this character trait could bring him. He looked at himself, his panther, and the skeleton zombie, his fairy and titan, as well as a gigantic skeleton dragon. In that moment, he made up his mind to conquer this world as Andreas.